Hi there. Tonight we step back into a world of lace and rigid expectations, of gaslight flickers and hushed whispers behind closed doors. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit drawing room, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the London fog, a faint scent of coal smoke and lavender lingering in the air. You're wearing a corset that probably makes breathing an Olympic sport, and polite conversation is a minefield of unspoken rules. Your future, your very identity, is inextricably linked to the patter of tiny feet, or, more accurately, the constant threat of their arrival. You see, for a Victorian woman, the pressure to produce children was less a gentle societal nudge and more an inescapable gravitational pull, shaping every decision, every hope, every silent dread. In this era, before reliable birth control, navigating your reproductive life was like trying to cross a busy street blindfolded while wearing a bustle. You probably wouldn't survive a single month of this, let alone a lifetime. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do feel free to post where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself, a woman of the Victorian era, facing a societal expectation so pervasive it feels like the very air you breathe. From the moment you exchange vows, perhaps even before, the expectation of progeny hangs over you like a persistent shadow. It's not just about providing an heir, though that's paramount for the upper classes. It's about fulfilling your perceived biological and social destiny. Your purpose, as defined by the patriarchal norms of the day, is to be a wife and, more importantly, a mother. Childlessness, by choice or by fate, often carries a heavy stigma, whispered about in drawing rooms and sighed over in parlours. Your status, your perceived worth, your very sense of womanhood are deeply intertwined with your ability to conceive and bear children. It's a weight that presses down on your shoulders, a constant, unspoken demand. This societal pressure isn't merely external, it's internalized. You grow up seeing your role modeled by your mother, your aunts, the women in your community. Large families are not just common, they are often seen as a sign of God's blessing, of domestic felicity, of a successful marriage. The Queen herself, Victoria, with her 9 children, sets a formidable example, embodying the ideal of prolific motherhood. This mainstream historical fact is the bedrock of your existence in this world. Your primary function as a woman is to be a vessel for new life. But beneath this veneer of expectation, a silent, desperate struggle is often playing out. While the world demands babies, you perhaps desire respite, a space to recover, or simply to exert some control over your own body and future. The constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing takes an enormous toll on your physical health, often leaving you weakened, exhausted, and vulnerable to a myriad of ailments. Your body is not your own, it is a factory, perpetually in production. And the sheer number of children, while admired, also brings with it immense financial strain and the constant threat of disease, a stark reality in an era without modern medicine. Many Victorian women, despite the overwhelming pressure, quietly longed for ways to space their pregnancies, or even to avoid them altogether. Historians still argue whether the perceived acceptance of large families was a genuine desire from women, or simply a resigned acceptance of their limited options. It's a nuanced discussion, isn't it? Because while some truly embraced prolific motherhood, others undoubtedly felt trapped by its inevitability. Imagine, for a moment, the quiet desperation that might settle over you as another pregnancy announces itself, another round of morning sickness, another confinement, another fragile life to worry over in a world where infant mortality is tragically common. This reality pushes many to seek out any method, no matter how unproven or frowned upon, to gain a modicum of control. It's a far cry from simply planning a family. It's about survival, both physical and emotional, in a world that offers precious little support. Your life, your very existence, is defined by your fertility and, paradoxically, by your quiet rebellion against it. So, with that immense pressure for progeny always looming, where did a Victorian woman turn? One of the most common, yet maddeningly unreliable methods whispered about was what we now call the rhythm method, or more colloquially, counting the days. Imagine you, a woman of the 19th century, with little formal education in anatomy or physiology, trying to decipher the mysteries of your own body's cycle. There are no ovulation predictor kits, no apps tracking your temperature, no readily available knowledge about fertile windows. Instead, you're relying on folklore, anecdotal evidence from older women, or perhaps a vague, often inaccurate understanding gleaned from a medical text written by a man who probably viewed the female body as a bizarre, unpredictable machine. You might be diligently marking a small personal calendar, perhaps in a hidden diary or on a scrap of paper tucked away from prying eyes. You're attempting to pinpoint your safe days, the times when conception is supposedly less likely. The problem, of course, is that the understanding of the female reproductive cycle in the Victorian era was, to put it mildly, rudimentary. Most theories focused on the assumption that ovulation occurred at a fixed point, usually midway through the cycle. What they didn't fully grasp was the variability from woman to woman, and even from cycle to cycle within the same woman. Your menstrual period itself was understood, but the days leading up to and immediately following it were a murky, unpredictable territory. Think of it like trying to predict the weather patterns in a foreign country based on a single, blurry photograph. You might get lucky sometimes, but more often than not you're going to get drenched, or in this case, pregnant. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of this method was due to a genuine, if flawed, belief in its efficacy, or simply a desperate attempt to exert some control when other options were non-existent or morally repugnant. It's a bit like trying to stop a charging elephant with a feather. You're certainly putting in the effort, but the outcome is rarely in your favor. This mainstream historical fact, the widespread use of a primitive rhythm method, underscores the limited scientific understanding of the era. The actual biological mechanisms of ovulation and fertilization were still largely a mystery, shrouded in Victorian modesty and scientific imprecision. You might try to explain to your husband that the moon isn't right tonight, but he might just chuckle and remind you that the moon was, in fact, always right for new life. Adding to the confusion was the quirky tidbit that some medical practitioners of the time actually encouraged variations of this method, often based on even wilder theories. Some believed that conception was only possible during menstruation itself, leading to truly baffling and entirely counterproductive advice. Others suggested that women were only fertile immediately after their period, or only during the first few days. It was a veritable smorgasbord of misinformation, each theory more likely to lead to a baby than prevent one. Imagine consulting your local doctor, a stern gentleman with a formidable beard, and an even more formidable array of leeches, and receiving advice that was, scientifically speaking, utter nonsense. You'd probably nod politely, thank him for his wisdom, and then continue to worry. The quiet frustration of trying to apply these vague, often contradictory rules to your own unpredictable body must have been immense. It was a constant gamble, a roll of the dice each month with the highest possible stakes. And, for all your diligent counting and whispered hopes, more often than not, the dice landed on baby. So, if counting the days was a crapshoot, what other options did a Victorian woman have? Well, there was the withdrawal method, or coitus interruptus, a practice as old as time itself. Imagine you, a woman of the 19th century, relying on your husband's self-control, a concept that might make you chuckle even today. This method, of course, hinges entirely on the male partner withdrawing before ejaculation, a feat that requires both significant discipline and, let's be honest, a deep level of consideration for your needs and desires. You might find yourself in the dimly lit bedroom, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles and unspoken anxieties. The act itself is fraught with tension, a delicate dance where one wrong move could have lasting consequences. You're acutely aware that the responsibility for preventing pregnancy, in this instance, rests entirely on your husband's shoulders. And while some men might approach this with the utmost care and attention, others, well, let's just say their priorities might lie elsewhere. It's a method that requires a level of communication and trust that might not always be present in Victorian marriages, where discussions about intimacy and reproduction were often shrouded in secrecy and awkwardness. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of this method was due to a lack of alternatives or a reflection of the power dynamics within Victorian relationships. It's a complex question, isn't it? Because while some couples might have used it effectively, others undoubtedly found it to be a source of frustration and resentment. This mainstream historical fact, the widespread reliance on withdrawal, highlights the limited options available to women and the heavy burden they often carried in preventing pregnancy. The very act itself, dependent on male cooperation, underscores the power imbalance that often existed within Victorian marriages. Adding to the awkwardness was the quirky tidbit that many medical texts of the time, while acknowledging the method, offered little practical advice on how to execute it effectively. Some even suggested that it was harmful to the male vitality, a concept that probably didn't do much to encourage its consistent use. Imagine your husband consulting a medical journal, only to find that his efforts to prevent pregnancy were being portrayed as a threat to his masculinity. It's a wonder any Victorian babies were conceived at all. The quiet frustration of relying on a method that was both unreliable and dependent on another person's self-control must have been immense. It was a constant negotiation, a silent plea for consideration, with the ever-present threat of an unwanted pregnancy looming large. And for all your hopes and whispered anxieties, the outcome was often, quite literally, out of your hands. If unreliable rhythms and male self-control weren't quite cutting it, another widely practiced method, often with equally ambiguous results, was extended breastfeeding. Imagine yourself a new mother in Victorian England, perhaps with a rosy-cheeked infant at your breast, another toddler tugging at your skirts, and the ever-present awareness of another potential pregnancy looming. You've likely heard whispers, perhaps from your own mother or an older aunt, that as long as you are nursing your baby, you won't conceive again. It's a common piece of folk wisdom passed down through generations, offering a glimmer of hope in a world with limited options. You find yourself diligently nursing your baby, often for much longer periods than might be common today, perhaps for well over a year or even two. The logic, as understood then, was that continuous nursing somehow delayed the return of fertility. And to a certain extent, there's a kernel of truth to this, a scientific reality that was dimly perceived, but not fully understood in the 19th century. Lactational amenorrhea, the suppression of ovulation due to high levels of prolactin from frequent and intense breastfeeding, can offer a degree of natural birth control. However, the key here is frequent and intense. This isn't just a few feedings a day. It's often round-the-clock nursing, delaying the introduction of solids, and generally keeping the baby at the breast as much as possible. Anything less, and its contraceptive effect diminishes dramatically. Historians still argue whether women intentionally prolonged breastfeeding primarily for birth control, or if it was a happy, if often unreliable, side effect of infant feeding practices. It's a fascinating debate, isn't it? Because while the primary motivation was undoubtedly nourishing the child, the secondary benefit of delaying another pregnancy must have been a powerful incentive for many. This mainstream historical fact, the belief in breastfeeding as a contraceptive, speaks volumes about both traditional knowledge and the desperate need for family planning methods. It was a tangible, natural process that women could control, unlike the whims of a calendar or a partner's discipline. But here's the quirky tidbit. Despite the widespread belief, its effectiveness was incredibly variable. Some women would indeed find their periods and thus their fertility returning quickly, even while nursing. Others would go for extended periods without a return of menstruation, perhaps for years. It was a biological lottery, leaving you in a perpetual state of uncertainty. You might cling to the hope that your diligent nursing was keeping another pregnancy at bay, only to find yourself with morning sickness, a cruel betrayal by your own body and the folk wisdom you had trusted. Imagine the quiet dread of realizing that despite all your efforts, another baby was on the way, perhaps before you had fully recovered from the last. It was a constant game of chance, a fragile hope in a world where your body's processes were still largely a mystery even to yourself. And for all your careful efforts, this method, while seemingly natural, often left you feeling as exposed as the others. When the rhythm method felt like guesswork and breastfeeding a biological lottery, many Victorian women turned to more direct, if equally unscientific, post-coital interventions. Imagine you, a woman of the 19th century, immediately after intimacy, rushing to the privacy of your washstand. The air is perhaps still warm from the gaslight, and you're faced with the urgent task of douching and internal cleansing. This wasn't about hygiene in the modern sense. It was a desperate, often frantic attempt to wash away any potential for conception. You might be using a bulb syringe, a rather primitive contraption, or simply pouring water from a pitcher. The solutions varied wildly, from plain water to more acidic concoctions involving vinegar, alum, or even, in more extreme cases, carbolic acid, a highly caustic substance that could cause serious burns. The belief was that these rinses would either physically flush out semen or create an acidic environment hostile to sperm. You're performing this ritual with a blend of hope and trepidation, trying to banish the specter of another pregnancy before it even has a chance to take root. The feeling of urgency, of racing against time, must have been palpable. This mainstream historical fact about the widespread practice of douching for birth control illustrates the profound lack of understanding of reproductive biology and the lengths to which women would go to avoid unwanted pregnancies. Historians still argue whether the perceived success of douching was a genuine effect or simply a coincidence, given the high rates of unwanted pregnancies despite its widespread use. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? Because while some women might have reported success, it was likely due to chance or other factors, rather than the efficacy of the rinse itself. The grim reality is that sperm are remarkably quick, and by the time you're reaching for that bulb syringe, many have likely already begun their journey. You might be meticulously douching, convinced you're preventing conception, while simultaneously life is already unfolding inside you. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some women even employed carbonated water or baking soda solutions, believing the bubbles or alkaline nature would somehow incapacitate sperm. Imagine the fizzy sensation, perhaps a strange tickle, as you try this peculiar method. It sounds almost comical now, doesn't it? But for you in that moment, it's a serious, if desperate, effort. The quiet frustration of trying these methods, day in and day out with no real certainty of their effectiveness, must have been profoundly unsettling. Each month, brings a fresh wave of anxiety, a wait to see if the rituals you performed had actually worked. And for all your careful efforts, the outcome was often, and devastatingly, another pregnancy. Beyond the fleeting hopes of douching, some Victorian women sought out more tangible, albeit still rudimentary, forms of protection. Barrier methods. Imagine you, a woman of means, discreetly acquiring a small, pliable device, perhaps made of rubber or a fine, oiled fabric. These were the nascent forms of what we now recognize as pessaries, or cervical caps, designed to physically block sperm from entering the uterus. They were far from the sophisticated diaphragms and caps of the 20th century, but in their time they represented a significant, if often impractical, leap in personal agency. You might be attempting to insert one of these devices yourself, perhaps, in the privacy of your bedchamber, guided by vague instructions and pure desperation. The challenges were considerable. These early barriers were often ill-fitting, uncomfortable, and difficult to place correctly. The material might be prone to degradation, or perhaps even cause irritation. There was no one-size-fits-all, and certainly no medical professional readily available to offer fitting advice. It was a clandestine affair, a quiet rebellion against the relentless march of nature. This mainstream historical fact, the existence and limited use of early barrier methods, reveals the early, hesitant steps towards empowering women with more direct control over their fertility. It highlights a burgeoning awareness, even if imperfect, of the biological process. Historians still argue whether the limited adoption of these devices was primarily due to their inefficiency, their cost, or the strong societal taboos surrounding anything that hinted at female sexuality or birth control. It's a complex interplay, isn't it? Because while the devices themselves were imperfect, the social landscape they existed within was even more restrictive. You might have heard whispers of these devices, but finding them, affording them, and then using them discreetly was a monumental task. The very act of seeking such a device could brand you as immoral or loose, a reputation no respectable Victorian woman could afford. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of these early pessaries were not just simple cups, but sometimes intricately designed contraptions meant to be worn for extended periods. Imagine a small, perhaps uncomfortable device remaining inside you, constantly reminding you of your silent struggle. And the cleaning? Oh, the cleaning! Without proper sterilization techniques, these reusable devices could become sources of infection, adding another layer of risk to an already precarious situation. It was a constant negotiation between the desire for control and the very real dangers of pioneering such methods in an era of limited medical knowledge. The quiet anxiety of whether the device was properly placed, whether it was actually working, must have been a constant companion. And despite your careful private efforts, the promise of these barriers often proved to be just that, a promise easily broken. If physical barriers presented their own set of challenges, some Victorian women explored another, often equally dubious, avenue: spermicides. Imagine you, in your private moments, concocting a mixture in a discreet basin, hoping that these homemade solutions would somehow neutralize the very spark of life. These weren't the scientifically formulated, clinically tested spermicides we know today. They were folk remedies and chemical experiments conducted in the domestic sphere, often based on little more than anecdotal evidence and a desperate hope. You might be mixing together ingredients whispered about amongst women: quinine, which was thought to have contraceptive properties, or perhaps acidic substances like lemon juice, vinegar, or even potent chemicals like mercuric chloride. The belief was that these substances inserted into the vagina would either kill sperm outright or create an environment so inhospitable that conception would be impossible. You're handling these ingredients with a blend of determination and trepidation, acutely aware that some of them could cause irritation or even harm. The scent of vinegar might linger, a testament to your clandestine efforts. This mainstream historical fact, the use of various homemade spermicidal concoctions, underscores the ingenuity and desperation of women in an era devoid of reliable medical options for birth control. Historians still argue whether the occasional reported success of these methods was due to a genuine, albeit weak, spermicidal effect, or simply coincidental timing with infertile periods. It's a bit like trying to put out a bonfire with a teacup of water. You might feel like you're doing something, but the impact is probably negligible. Many of these substances, while potentially irritating, were unlikely to be truly effective at killing sperm, which are incredibly resilient. You might meticulously apply your concoction, believing you've created an impenetrable fortress, while silently, inevitably, life finds a way. Now for a truly quirky tidbit. Some women even experimented with crushed galls, plant growths caused by insects, mixed with astringents, believing their properties would somehow tighten or seal the cervix. Imagine the sheer dedication required to gather such obscure ingredients and then prepare them for such a personal and intimate use. It sounds like something out of an alchemist's handbook, doesn't it? The quiet frustration of relying on such unpredictable and potentially harmful remedies must have been immense. Each month brought with it the same anxious weight, the same questioning of whether your latest potion had actually worked. And for all your careful measuring and quiet hopes, these spermicides often left you feeling as exposed and vulnerable as ever. When all else failed, or when the sheer exhaustion of repeated pregnancies became unbearable, some Victorian women were effectively forced into a form of involuntary contraception, abstinence, often under the guise of the rest cure. Imagine you, a woman of the upper or middle classes diagnosed with female hysteria, a catch-all term for everything from anxiety to ennui, but often rooted in the psychological and physical toll of constant childbearing. Your doctor, a stern man with an air of absolute authority, prescribes a radical treatment, complete bed rest, isolation, and absolute inactivity. You find yourself confined to your bedroom, perhaps even a darkened room, forbidden from reading, writing, sewing, or even socializing. Your meals are brought to you, you are bathed by a nurse, and your every need is attended to, often without you having to lift a finger. On the surface, it sounds like a luxurious retreat, a respite from the demands of domestic life. But in reality, it's a gilded cage. This mainstream historical fact, the widespread application of the rest cure, though ostensibly for nervous ailments, often served as an unspoken and rather draconian method of preventing further pregnancies. By isolating women and removing them from their husband's presence, it effectively enforced a period of complete abstinence. Historians still argue whether doctors genuinely believed in the therapeutic benefits of the rest cure for all its prescribed ailments, or if it was sometimes a convenient way to manage women who were exhibiting distress due to their domestic burdens, including unwanted pregnancies. It's a bit like diagnosing a leaky roof as house sadness and then prescribing a blanket over the hole. You might feel temporarily better, but the root cause remains. You might be told you're fragile and need to regain your strength, but in the quiet hours, you understand the deeper, unstated purpose of your confinement. Now for a quirky tidbit. While some women certainly found periods of rest beneficial, the extreme version of the rest cure, particularly as championed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, was incredibly restrictive. Patients were sometimes force-fed, not allowed visitors, and even forbidden to turn over in bed without assistance. Imagine the psychological toll of such enforced idleness, the mind left to wander, while the body is rendered completely passive. It was a form of control, a way to subdue what was seen as female nervousness. which often manifested as a desire for more autonomy. The quiet frustration of being rendered utterly helpless, even in the name of your own health, must have been profoundly disempowering. And for all its promises of recovery, the rest cure often served primarily as a means to halt your reproductive cycle, effectively placing your fertility on involuntary, indefinite hold. When all other methods, from the unreliable to the draconian, failed or were deemed insufficient, some Victorian women, driven to desperation, entered the shadowy and perilous world of abortion. Imagine you, a woman facing an unwanted pregnancy, burdened by the physical and emotional toll, perhaps fearing social ruin or unable to afford another mouth to feed. You are living in an era where abortion is not only illegal, but deeply stigmatized, whispered about in hushed tones and fraught with immense danger. This isn't a clinical procedure in a sterile environment. It's a desperate gamble in the clandestine corners of society. You might be seeking out a wise woman in a back alley, a self-proclaimed expert, or perhaps even attempting dangerous home remedies. The methods employed were often crude, barbaric, and life-threatening. From ingesting poisonous concoctions like ergot or lead salts, which often led to severe illness or death for the woman herself, to attempting to induce miscarriage through physical trauma or inserting sharp objects, the risks were terrifyingly high. Infection, hemorrhage, and permanent injury were not just possibilities, they were grim probabilities. This mainstream historical fact, the prevalence of illegal and dangerous abortions, is a testament to the immense pressure on Victorian women to control their fertility, even at the cost of their own lives and health. Historians still argue whether the perceived rise in abortion rates during the latter half of the 19th century was due to increased awareness of methods, greater desperation among women, or simply better record-keeping as authorities attempted to crack down on the practice. It's a dark stain on the era's social fabric, isn't it? Because while society condemned the act, it often failed to provide viable alternatives, pushing women into these perilous choices. You might be making this agonizing decision with a profound sense of isolation, knowing that confession could lead to public disgrace or even legal repercussions. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some abortionists cleverly disguised their services by advertising treatments for delayed menstruation or restoratives for female complaints. These euphemisms were a thin veil understood by those desperate enough to seek them out. Imagine seeing such an advertisement, perhaps in a discreet newspaper column, and the silent hope it might ignite, quickly followed by the cold dread of the inherent risks. The quiet fear of detection, the agony of the procedure itself, and the haunting possibility of death or permanent injury must have been immense. And even if you survived the ordeal, the emotional scars would undoubtedly linger, a secret burden, carried in silence. This desperate measure highlights the extreme lengths to which women would go when all other avenues were closed, underscoring the profound and often tragic consequences of a society that offered little control over one's own body. Beyond the dangerous back alleys and clandestine abortions, a Victorian woman desperate for control might also encounter the bewildering world of quack remedies and elixirs. Imagine yourself scanning the pages of a newspaper, perhaps a women's magazine, or even a handbill tacked to a lamppost. Amidst advertisements for tonics to cure consumption and elixirs for male vitality, you might spot an ad for a female compound, a regulator, or a remedy for female complaints, subtly hinting at its true purpose, to either induce a delayed period or prevent conception. You might send away for a bottle or visit a discreet chemist, paying a hefty sum for a concoction promising relief. These patent medicines were often a mysterious blend of herbs, alcohol, and sometimes even more, dangerous substances like opium, lead, or mercury. They came with grand claims and vague instructions, preying on the hopes and fears of women who had nowhere else to turn. You'd swallow the bitter liquid, perhaps with a grimace, hoping that this expensive, unproven remedy would somehow work its magic. This mainstream historical fact, the proliferation of quack medicines promising to regulate female cycles, highlights the unregulated nature of the pharmaceutical market and the exploitation of women's reproductive anxieties. Historians still argue whether the occasional effectiveness of these female regulators was due to their mild abortifacient properties, the placebo effect, or simply coincidental timing with a woman's natural cycle. It's a bit like buying a magic potion that promises to make your plants grow taller. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but you're always left wondering if it was the potion or just good sunlight. Many of these elixirs were essentially harmless, relying on the power of suggestion, while others were actively dangerous, causing illness or even death. You might be taking a daily dose, quietly hopeful, while unbeknownst to you, you're simply ingesting a mixture of alcohol and inert ingredients, or worse, something genuinely harmful. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some of these female pills were advertised with highly suggestive names like Dr. Pinkham's vegetable compound or Lydia E. Pinkham's pink pills for pale people, subtly implying their use for menstrual irregularities, which was code for inducing abortion or preventing pregnancy. Imagine the knowing glance exchanged between women, the unspoken understanding of what these innocent-sounding names truly signified. It was a clandestine language, a secret code amongst those desperate enough to decode it. The quiet desperation of trying these remedies, clinging to every last shred of hope that this time something might actually work, must have been utterly exhausting. And for all your careful adherence to the instructions, these quack elixirs often left you feeling poorer, no less anxious, and still very much at the mercy of your own biology. While the focus often remains on women's struggles, it's crucial to remember that men, too, played a role in the contraceptive landscape of Victorian times, however limited. Imagine your husband, perhaps a businessman or a laborer, navigating a world where discussions of male sexuality were even more hushed than those concerning women. Yet, even in this era of stiff collars and strict social codes, male contraception, primarily in the form of condoms, existed, albeit in rudimentary forms and with a very different public perception. You might be vaguely aware of these devices, perhaps through whispers or discreet advertisements for sheaths or preventatives found in less reputable publications. These weren't the latex wonders of today. Early condoms were often made from animal intestines, sheep cecum for instance, finely prepared and sometimes reusable, or from rubber, which was a newer, more expensive material. They would have been thick, unwieldy, and far from universally comfortable. Your husband might acquire one from a barber, a seedy apothecary, or even a traveling salesman, not exactly the sort of place one picked up polite conversation. This mainstream historical fact, the presence of early condoms, demonstrates that the concept of barrier contraception wasn't exclusively female, though its social acceptance and availability for men were equally fraught with issues. Historians still argue whether the limited use of condoms was primarily due to their discomfort, their cost, or the prevailing moral objections that viewed any form of birth control as an affront to religious or societal norms. It's a bit like trying to sell ice to an Eskimo, but telling him he can only use it on Tuesdays and it might spontaneously combust. The stigma was immense, and the act of using one often implied a lack of true virility or a premarital indiscretion. You, as his wife, might find yourself relying on his willingness to procure and use such a device, a dependence that varied wildly from man to man. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of these early rubber condoms were so thick and poorly manufactured that they had a distinct seam, making them quite uncomfortable. Imagine the tactile experience of such a device, certainly not conducive to Victorian romance. They also had to be washed and dried after each use, a rather unromantic chore that surely limited their appeal for repeated use. The quiet friction, both literal and metaphorical, surrounding these male devices underscores the complex dance between societal expectations and personal desires. For all the moralizing, the reality was that men, like women, sought ways to control reproduction, even if those ways were awkward, uncomfortable, and often hidden from polite society. Regardless of the crude methods or questionable elixirs, the overriding reality for a Victorian woman was the relentless weight of social pressures and expectations. Imagine yourself attending a polite afternoon tea, the clinking of teacups and the murmur of conversation filling the air. You're acutely aware of the subtle scrutiny, the gentle inquiries about your family, the polite but pointed questions about when you might expect another blessing. Your existence, your very identity, was often defined by your reproductive capacity, and your primary duty, as dictated by society, was to be a mother. You find yourself navigating a world where large families were not just common, but celebrated, seen as a sign of respectability, virtue, and God's favor. From sermons preached in churches to articles in popular magazines, the narrative was consistent. A woman's highest calling was motherhood. The idea of choosing not to have children, or even limiting their number, was often considered selfish, unnatural, or even morally depraved. Your worth was inextricably linked to your womb. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive societal expectation of prolific motherhood, was a powerful, invisible force shaping every aspect of a Victorian woman's life, making the desire for birth control a profoundly rebellious act. Historians still argue whether the apparent acceptance of these large families was a genuine desire among women or a forced resignation to a destiny they couldn't escape due to lack of options and societal coercion. It's a bit like being told that eating spinach every day is your patriotic duty, and then being praised for having a particularly healthy complexion, even if you secretly loathe spinach. You might genuinely love your children, but the constant pressure to produce more, irrespective of your health, resources, or emotional state, was a suffocating burden. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some social commentators even argued that smaller families were a sign of moral decay or national weakness, implying that women who limited their offspring were somehow letting down the empire. Imagine being subtly accused of being unpatriotic because you wished for a break between pregnancies. It sounds almost comical, doesn't it? But for you, it was a real and heavy judgment. The quiet fear of being labeled barren, selfish, or unwomanly for failing to meet these expectations must have been immensely stressful. You're constantly performing, projecting an image of serene domesticity and maternal contentment, while perhaps secretly yearning for a moment of respite, a choice over your own body. This unrelenting pressure made the pursuit of any form of birth control, however crude or dangerous, a desperate, solitary act of defiance against a society that offered little understanding or support. Given the immense social pressures and the questionable efficacy of self-administered remedies, where did the official medical community stand on the issue of birth control? Imagine you, a Victorian woman, summoning the courage to consult your family doctor, a stern gentleman perhaps more accustomed to lancing boils than discussing delicate matters of reproduction. You'd likely find that medical professionals offered very little practical, safe, or willing advice on preventing pregnancy. In fact, their stance was often one of profound conservatism, rooted in both prevailing moral codes and a limited scientific understanding. You might be met with a paternalistic lecture on the sanctity of marriage and the duties of a wife, rather than concrete advice on contraception. Doctors of the era often viewed female reproductive organs through a lens of inherent fragility and mystery, believing that interfering with natural processes could lead to dire consequences, from nervous disorders to outright insanity. Their primary focus, when it came to women's health, was often on managing pregnancy and childbirth, and treating the myriad ailments that arose from frequent parturition. This mainstream historical fact, the medical establishment's general unwillingness to provide birth control information, was a significant barrier for women seeking to control their family size. Historians still argue whether this reluctance stemmed more from genuine medical ignorance, deeply ingrained moral objections, or a desire to maintain social order and male authority within the family unit. It's a bit like asking your mechanic why your car won't start, and instead of looking at the engine, he gives you a sermon on the virtues of walking. The medical community was certainly not immune to the pervasive social norms of the time, and many doctors genuinely believed that large families were God's will or simply nature's course. You might leave their office feeling more frustrated and ashamed than enlightened, clutching a prescription for a nervous tonic instead of any real solution. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medical texts of the period actually warned against excessive sexual activity, not necessarily for birth control, but because it was believed to deplete male vitality or cause female hysteria. It was less about family planning and more about regulating perceived moral and physical excesses. Imagine the irony of a doctor cautioning against too much marital intimacy, while simultaneously refusing to provide any tools to manage its natural consequence. The quiet desperation of facing a medical establishment that was often more judgmental than helpful, more moralistic than scientific, must have been profoundly disempowering. You were left to navigate your deepest anxieties about family size largely on your own, with little support from the very people who were supposed to be the arbiters of health. Despite the stifling social pressures and the medical community's reluctance, the very conditions that made birth control so necessary for Victorian women also began to spark the earliest embers of organized feminism's voice. Imagine you, a woman, tired of the relentless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and the endless domestic drudgery. You might hear whispers of a new movement, a radical idea that women deserved more than just their traditional roles. These nascent feminist voices, though still marginalized, began to quietly, then more loudly, demand reproductive autonomy. You might encounter pamphlets or hear lectures, perhaps in a discreet gathering, arguing for voluntary motherhood, a revolutionary concept that challenged the very foundations of Victorian society. This wasn't about explicit discussions of contraceptives in public squares, but about the fundamental right of a woman to decide when and if she would bear children. It was a recognition that control over one's body was central to any broader form of female emancipation. This mainstream historical fact, the emergence of voluntary motherhood as a key tenet of early feminism, marks a pivotal shift, moving beyond individual desperation to a collective demand for change. Historians still argue whether the focus on voluntary motherhood was a pragmatic response to the immediate suffering of women, or a strategic entry point into broader feminist goals that would have been too radical to discuss openly at the time. It's a bit like trying to open a locked door with a series of smaller, less threatening keys, hoping one will eventually turn the main lock. The activists understood that, without control over their bodies, women could never truly achieve independence in education, work, or political life. You might feel a surge of recognition, a sense of solidarity, hearing these forbidden ideas articulated, realizing that your private struggle was part of a larger, shared burden. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some early advocates for women's rights, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, while not explicitly endorsing contraception, certainly championed the idea of women having the right to decide when and how often they became mothers. Their rhetoric often focused on the burden of excessive childbearing on women's health and societal progress. Imagine the quiet power of these women, dressed in their respectable Victorian attire, subtly challenging centuries of patriarchal norms. The quiet courage it took to even utter such thoughts, let alone organize around them, must have been immense. And for all the resistance they faced, these early feminist voices laid the crucial groundwork for future movements that would eventually bring reproductive freedom closer to reality for countless women. Their whispers, in time, would become a roar. As our journey through the Victorian bedroom draws to a close, we are left with the enduring legacy of struggle and the quiet battles fought in those hushed, gaslit spaces. Imagine reflecting on the lives of these women, your own hypothetical existence in their corseted world. You've navigated a landscape of desperate attempts at contraception, from unreliable folk wisdom to dangerous remedies, all while facing immense societal pressure to endlessly reproduce. The picture is one of profound resilience, a testament to the human spirit's unwavering desire for autonomy, even in the face of overwhelming odds. You now understand that the Victorian woman's fight for reproductive control wasn't about a sudden, revolutionary change in technology or law, but about a slow, arduous chipping away at deeply ingrained social norms and scientific ignorance. Her methods were often crude, her knowledge limited, and her risks immense. This mainstream historical fact, the centuries-long private war fought by women for control over their fertility, is a powerful reminder of how hard-won many of our modern freedoms truly are. It shapes our understanding of women's roles, their health, and their aspirations in an era often romanticized for its outward propriety. Historians still argue whether the quiet subversion of traditional reproductive norms contributed more to the eventual rise of birth control advocacy, or if changing economic and social conditions were the primary drivers. It's a bit like trying to determine whether the melting of an ice sculpture is due more to the subtle warmth of the room or the occasional ray of sunshine. It's likely a complex interplay of forces. You might ponder the countless untold stories, the quiet anxieties, the whispered secrets exchanged between mothers and daughters, sisters and friends, all seeking to alleviate the burden of unwanted pregnancies. Here's a quirky tidbit to carry with you as we drift off. The sheer volume of euphemistic advertisements for female pills and regulators in Victorian newspapers far outstripped the actual open discussion of birth control. It highlights a society that simultaneously condemned the practice while tacitly acknowledging its desperate demand. Imagine the irony of a public sphere brimming with hidden clues and coded messages about a topic too scandalous to name outright. The quiet strength and ingenuity of these women, innovating and experimenting in their private spheres, often with dangerous consequences, is truly remarkable. Their experiences underscore the profound, ongoing importance of reproductive freedom. The struggles of Victorian women, their desperate search for agency over their own bodies, laid a crucial, albeit often unacknowledged, groundwork for the eventual arrival of more reliable contraception in the 20th century. Their whispers became the foundations for future movements, their silent battles paving the way for choices we often take for granted today. As the gaslights dim and the hum of the city outside fades, you can almost hear the rustle of their silk dresses, the quiet sighs in darkened rooms, the enduring echo of their resilience. Let the anxieties of a bygone era, the struggle for autonomy, gently recede now. The history, the knowledge, the quiet defiance of those women now drifts away on the soft currents of your breath. Allow yourself to loosen your grip on the days, thoughts, letting them soften and blur. The whispers of the past are becoming fainter, merging with the calm, steady rhythm of your own heart. All the complexities, all the worries, all the curious details, they are simply sounds now, fading into the comfortable quiet. Just listen to the soft hush, feel the peaceful stillness surrounding you, and let your mind unwind.